Hey everyone! Today I'm talking with JD Evans. She's a self published fantasy author best known for her award winning series Mages of the Wheel. We're going to be discussing her debut novel Reign and Ruin, and we're going to talk about world building, her characters, and what inspired this romantasy world. So let's get right into the interview. The first question that I had was, how did you navigate the shift from military discipline to the creative freedom of writing romantasy? Because I assume like the military life is very structured, and not that it doesn't take structure and discipline to write romantasy too, but I'm assuming they're very different worlds. So yeah, how did you navigate all that?
Yeah, so I grew up writing. I think most writers start writing when they're kids, and so that kind of creativity, that enjoyment of it as like an outlet was always there. It's always been a hobby, just like it was kind of as fulfilling as reading. And then, the military is just very separate from that. And it was like a hobby on the side. And then when I got out of the military, me and my husband moved and had a kid, and there was just a lot of gap between the military and when I actually finally started taking it seriously. So there are aspects of what I did in the military that I think help with my writing. I deployed to the Middle East a few times and I worked at the embassy in Beirut. And the cultural navigation, the experience of different peoples, cultures, religions, places, geography, I think that really adds to a writer's ability to create something that makes sense when you're world building. And then as a intelligence officer, I did a lot of collating data, right? So I'd take a lot of information and I would condense it down to something palatable for the people that I was informing. And that translates pretty well to writing or even like blurbs or giving your elevator pitch or whatever, those sorts of things. So it did help in that way.
Oh, amazing. And yeah, so you're mentioning you were in the Middle East. So this segues to question number two, where Middle Eastern settings are super rare in fantasy. What responsibilities do you feel, if any, when writing from that cultural lens?
Well, for one, I approach it as a appreciation of what I love and experienced in the culture. I'm not necessarily commercially trying to make something different, or I'm not putting it in as a nod to diversity or as a attempt to get away from the classic medieval Europe setting. I genuinely loved the culture and the place and the geography and the thousands of years of history. I think that that is the place to start because then you are interested in learning and being respectful and you want to get it right, as opposed to I watched Disney's Aladdin once and now I'm going to write something set in Baghdad, right? And then also, I think it is important that I am familiar with other authors that are own voices in that setting so that I can recommend them. I am also like aware of the political situations there and can speak to them. I'm not just using something. Does that make
Of
sense?
course, yeah. And it's your experience as well. You were there for quite a
Right.
while. So you're
Yeah,
not just writing about something that you don't know, you
exactly.
experience it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think it is possible to an extent to write about something maybe that you haven't personally experienced. I am going to caveat that to an extent. If you're using a historical setting of a different culture or different people, if you have researched, and R.F. Kuang talks about this a little bit, you can write stories from different perspectives, but you need to research. You can't just use the stereotypes. You can't just throw out the architecture you saw in a picture once. Like, why does the architecture look that way? Why do people do this? And like, I made a very conscious decision to step really far away from using Islam, which my setting is Ottoman Turkish, and Islam is a huge part of that history. But I am not Muslim, and I am not comfortable, even with research, navigating in that space respectfully. So I think it's things like that. Like, there are stories I would never try to write, like growing up as a Middle Eastern immigrant
Yeah.
in middle class America. I would never do that.
Yeah.
But if I'm inspired by a setting and I'm respectfully representing it, I think we can work from that place.
That makes total sense. And I mean, speaking from my experience, so right now I'm working on a project that's loosely based on Mulan. And obviously that's based in China, but I don't know anything about China. I've never been, I've never experienced their culture. So for me, I was like, okay, like, do I have to write this in that setting to like pay homage to them? But then if I don't do it right, I feel like that's worse. So yeah,
Right.
so that's why I'm just gonna set it in a different setting that I'm comfortable with, just so
Yeah,
I don't insult the culture by getting it wrong.
sure.
Yeah.
There's definitely retellings and shifting of pieces, and all of that is, I think, fine. I don't think there's generally a problem with that, as long as it makes sense in your story, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and I just wanted to say, so when I was reading Rain and Ruin, the food that you talk about, so that's the food that I grew up with. So it was like the first time that I saw that in a fantasy book, and I was like, yay, like I can relate to this stuff. I know what this stuff is. So
And
um,
I have heard that a few times. A lot of folks from the Middle East and Daisy culture have been like the clothes, and I recognize the food, and I love food. So I
same.
was pretty obsessed with it when I came back. So yeah.
Okay, so question number three. How long did Rain and Ruin take from first spark to publication? And were there any points where you almost just gave up on the whole thing?
Feel like every writer goes through ups and downs with giving up, right? It's a little hard to answer at this point because it's been a while and I was in the fog of early motherhood when it happened. But the bones of Rain and Ruin came from an old story I'd written years ago with like the personalities, and maybe the two kingdoms colliding together. But the idea of the story happened. I don't remember when I read this book, and I am not going to remember the name of it. I never do when I try to talk about it. It was this random book I read set in industrial England, so like early 1900s. And it was about this girl that got pregnant out of wedlock and she ran away from her family to London and somehow kind of fell in as a maid at this guy's house that made fireworks. And it was very depressing, very dark book. But there was like just the seed of a love story, and that's often how I get my ideas. And I guess in a way it was almost like a fan fiction. So I took those characters, and that is where my fourth book, which absolutely has nothing to do with London or fireworks or anything. It was just the idea of this kind of sad social recluse and this girl from the country coming together. And that's my book four. And then I built the idea around that. And I'd say from that to publishing maybe took a couple years. Maybe I think you reach a point, or I reached a point where you're like sick of it and you have to finish it and you have to get rid of it and you have to move on. And I think that most writers are going to hit that point at some point, particularly in that first novel, where you don't really know if it's ready, but you know you are done. You know, you need to go. And that's how I felt. And I also was, as I said, in the early throes, I had an 18-month-old and I just kind of wanted to get a little of myself back, you know?
Yeah.
So it's, I'd say a couple years, but then I like quickly went through the first three books and then I burnt out here.
It's okay. You
So,
took a break.
yeah, exactly. Every book, I'm convinced I'll never write another book again. I should just give up, and people aren't going to like it as much as the last one. And it wasn't this hard last time. And I mean, I go through that with every book, every time, and I think that's pretty universal, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so question number four. So I want to talk a little bit about your world building process.
Okay.
Are you somebody who outlines a lot, who uses like a beat sheet? Do you use any tools that are helpful, like Scrivener or Notion or World Anvil or whatever?
Every book I've written, I've had to kind of change my process a little just because I'm going through stages of life with the kids and moving and my schedule is always different. And so what worked on the last one might not work with the first one. I'm not much of an outliner. I am a plantser. So I I do keep a beat sheet, and that is kind of learned from trial and error. Before I was a mom, it was very easy to just hold a story in my head and remember the ideas I had and just kind of watch the movie in my head and then write it down. But as a mom, that does not happen anymore. And if I don't write things down, I will not remember them. So if I have an idea, I immediately put it in the notes app on my phone. And then I have a Scrivener file for every single book, and I'll have just like a dump, one of the thing, like a notes page where I dump all that stuff. It might be memes or little convos from social media. It might be a video. It might be a link to a research thing or just a song I was listening to that inspired a scene. I put all of that there. It's like how my brain used to work. I used to have a file in my brain for that. Now I have to put that there. And then I've learned through trial and error that a beat sheet works for me. So when I go into a story and I know the scenes I want to have, I write those out. And then I think this is more common than one might believe with all the writing advice out there, but I do what's often called like writing in the headlights. So you write what you can see ahead of you, and then as you move forward, you more like you don't necessarily know what the next scene is going to be until you write the one you're in. And so then on the beat sheet, as new ideas come, I can move that stuff around. However, since I have this big long 6 book series and you're trying to drop hints and you have to know your ending, right? You can't drop hints if you don't know where you're going. So some of those come later. And if you built your world strong enough, you can often make it fit. You can retcon it a bit. My world building, is like learned from, again, like the military. I was also in a branch called Civil Affairs, and they do stabilization operations. So they do things like build schools and dig wells and hand out backpacks and things like that. And we talked a lot about something called the second and third order effect. So if you build a well, people have water. That's the first order effect. But what is the second and third order effect? And that would be people have water and they no longer need to hike miles to get water. They get time back in their day. They can do other things with that time. And those effects ripple out. That's second and third order effects. So when you're building a world, it's all about asking questions. And you're never going to build a world that's 100% complete. You're going to build a world that speaks to the things that are important to you. And social issues are important to me, class and capitalism and people, interrelations. I love people and how they interact and psychology. And so when I ask second and third order effects questions, that's what I do. If I have a princess, Naomi, and then in book 2, I switch over to some other characters and they're not the same class as her, they're not the same economic, how are they going to act? Are they going to see Naomi the same way that people at the same level as Naomi see her? And the answer is no, because no, people don't. So I think that's the most important takeaway I would say of world building is when you're asking questions, don't just ask those surface level questions. Ask what the ripple effect on your society is, right?
No, that's amazing. And that's actually something that I can also reflect on and use for my own project. That's super helpful. Yes. So this is like a fun question. What was your absolute favorite scene to write in Rain and Ruin?
Oh, that was a
If
tough
you
one. I
had
was
one.
thinking about that. It's always so hard to pick. People be like, what's your favorite book? Who's your favorite character? And
Yeah.
it's all for different reasons, right? I like both the tent scene and the scene where Naomi gets grumpy in the palace with Makram and his brother. And I guess also the scene where Makram returns and she's like falling apart, right? It's a good scene. So it's hard to pick a favorite, but one of those three probably, depending on the day.
So it's Naimi. That's how you pronounce it?
Maybe, yeah. And
Because in my
it's,
head it was Naim, but I guess yeah.
it's hard. I've seen people say name. I'm like, really? Do you really?
No, it's not name. So it's Naimi.
Naomi.
Naimi.
Yeah, Naomi.
So
Yeah.
she was probably one of the most like level-headed characters I've ever come across. Like there's a lot like I read a lot of fantasy and a lot of the main characters like at some point they're annoying or they make like not very smart decisions. But with her, I never really felt that way. And I was like, yes, like she knows what she's doing. She knows what she wants. Um, so I wanted to ask, was she inspired by anybody in your life, or did she just like grow organically as you wrote her?
I think she was inspired by me wishing that I was like Naomi, um, because that is not
Your
me.
ideal self
Right.
is what.
Yeah. Naomi thinks of the perfect comeback in the moment, and I don't think of it till a week later,
Right.
right?
I think
A
all
bit
of
of it
us
was
are
wishful thinking.
like.
I went into the series, so this is a bit of a long, but it comes back around. I am a recovering, not like other girls. As a kid, I was very tomboy. I grew up in a fairly misogynistic kind of environment. It wasn't like actively, but it was pretty normal for the time, to have a lot of feminine things sort of habitually downgraded, right? And I grew up wanting to squash all the femininity and that anything that was strength was what it looked like in the men that I knew. And that's part of why I ended up in the military, right? I wanted to be tough. And I realized later in life that I had missed out, and it makes me emotional. I had missed out on the wonderful friendship that women have with each other. And it's unfortunate because, like, as I said, I grew up with old school fantasy, and a lot of that women are very catty to each other, and
Mhm.
there's just this horrendous misinformation campaign about women and how they are to each other. So back to my point, I wanted to celebrate the many ways that women are strong that are not necessarily that kind of patriarchal idea of strength. So, not necessarily she can wield a sword as well as any man, but like social intelligence, emotional intelligence. Yeah, like Naimi's more like classic maneuvering intelligence. I do have a stabby character in the next book, but she's still not nuts, right? And then I have one that's very emotional and I have one that's very kind. And I wanted specifically to highlight those strengths in each book with each character. So that's one of the reasons that Naime is the way she is, because I also was there for the rise of the badass female character, which is a good character, and we do love her. I think initially what she was a man
Yeah.
that looked like a woman. And I mean that in that she still had all those patriarchal leadership traits, but she was a woman. And we didn't highlight any of the really wonderful qualities that you see and that they talk about in like the Bechdel test. Did women talk to
Yeah,
each other? Did they talk
exactly.
to each other that wasn't about a man? Like, all those things. So that was what I was going for in these books.
That actually resonates so much with me because so the first project that I had started working on almost 2 years ago. So it was like this strong, like physically strong female character who was like a pit fighter. And then eventually I said to myself, why is this the only type of strength that we see as like valid strength? Like
As a
feminine
heroine,
strengths
why
are
does she have to
still
be this way? Yeah.
exactly. And I read also so many books written by women authors where there's a strong female character and then everyone around her is a man. There is not a single other one. So it's great. Okay, the main character is female, but then she has no friends. There are no female friendships in the book. It's just her
Right.
and a bunch of dudes. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I completely understand
Yeah.
where you're
And
coming.
it's a bummer because like I said, I mean, I sound a little simpy right now, but like female friendship is so interesting because female friendship and male friendship is very different.
Mhm.
We interact differently, we do different things, and women support each other in different ways. And that is such a cool thing to highlight in a book and use it in a plot and use it in your world building. And it's like completely untapped, like just being a nerd about it. I feel like people are missing out on a lot of things that you could write about and kind of freshen up some of these things, particularly in romantasy. We're pretty bad about it. It's pretty copy paste. And I'm
Yeah,
not trying to insult anybody or say anything's wrong with it, but I think there's ways to open it up a little bit.
absolutely. I completely agree. Yeah, when I was like outlining, I was like, okay, are there enough female characters? Like I want to balance it out. I want more female characters than there are male characters because something that's, people kind of ignore.
Yeah, absolutely. You have your female character. Maybe she has a friend. Maybe she has the antagonistic. I think more than any other trope and it's less. It's so much less now. People are getting much better about
Yeah.
friendships. But for a while, the only other female in the book was like the rival, right?
Yeah.
And that is just exhausting to
Yeah.
read. Like, I've never actually met a woman in life that was as awful as some of these like rivals are in these
No,
romances.
exactly.
So it's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Okay, so what advice would you give to fantasy writers who want to self-publish, especially in terms of like editing and marketing?
Yeah. So right now, indie publishing is a really valid way to do things. You have to really sit with yourself and you got to think about it because it's a lot of work. You have to do everything. And especially if you get popular and you do well and you're successful, it gets very overwhelming very fast. And if you can't put the work in, but you still want to self-publish, then you have to accept that there are millions of books out there and you may not succeed to the amount that you want to. And also that as a self-published author, it's very hard to get noticed. My series did not really take off and become popular until I wrote my fourth book and published it. And that is 3 years where I maybe had no sales. A $15 day was a fantastic day. So people need to be really realistic about the journey and how long it can take. For example, I am friends with Carissa Broadbent,
Mhm.
and she wrote Crowns of Nyaxia and Daughter of No Worlds. Daughter of No Worlds was popular and made a living for her, but she didn't take off until she'd written Nyaxia.
Mhm.
And that was her third series, right?
Mhm.
So I think we got to be realistic about the timeline. And you need some kind of editing. You can bootstrap it a little bit. Some people just do beta readers, friends. There's a lot of discussion over whether your cover or your editing is more important.
Oof.
Because they're expensive either
Yeah.
way. Right now, I was again talking to a critique partner, and she's trying to find an editor, and it was very, very expensive,
Yep.
insanely expensive. And if you're writing big, chunky fantasy books, they're even more expensive.
You're looking at like 2, 3K, I think,
Yes, you are.
minimum. Yeah.
Yeah. But on the other hand, trad is not what it used to be. It isn't, I hand you my book and you
No.
get this great editor and you get all this press and it's not like that anymore. I spoke with a gal from Hachette who was at this last book convention I was at. And she was saying that particularly like when they're grabbing up the indies that get popular on Book Talk or whatever, they often do not edit those books at all. And then they condense your timeline because they're trying to match the speed at which an indie can publish a book. And they're not putting the marketing. They're not going to send you on a tour with your book. It's not going to happen unless you come with a big enough audience for that to pay off for them.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I heard. Like, even if you go trad publishing, they prefer people who already have a huge following.
Yeah,
So,
it's harder to get picked up when they can just grab somebody off TikTok that's
yeah.
going crazy at the moment. So it's a weird environment to navigate right now. And it's really important to like get into the groups and read on threads and read on Facebook if you're on Facebook. I don't know that Instagram has a lot. There's a lot of people on TikTok that talk business and publishing, and it's that classic phrase drinking from a fire hose, but there's a lot to know. And you can do it. It's possible. Um, and
You
it's
got
a
to put a
very,
lot of work in.
you do. You have to do and be realistic. I think the biggest thing is you got to be realistic. I see so many people that self-publish and then are devastated when nothing happens with their debut book. And I don't really know any self-published authors that have a debut book, like a true debut that's taken off immediately. It just doesn't happen. It's possible if you have built a TikTok phone. It happened for Lightlark,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think. Alex Astor, that's her name. She built this huge TikTok following and then launched this book to huge success, right? So that's a way to do it, but are you good at TikTok? Not all of us are,
It's
right?
it's a full-time job in and of
Yeah.
itself, like doing all of that.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah, what I started to kind of like write about, because I have like over a decade of marketing experience. Like before I started my business, I was a full-time marketer. So I'm trying to build this like kind of program to help authors build their audience before they even publish.
Yeah,
So
awesome.
if at the beginning of their book or even like in the middle of it, to just start trying to build like an email list or a following or whatever, just so that they're
Yeah.
not like devastated when they're done and they're like, oh, like why doesn't
Yeah,
anyone know?
crickets.
Or what exactly? So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm trying to like impart my knowledge about marketing to these aspiring authors to help them before they
And I think
publish.
that's one, I think that's awesome. And I think one of the biggest bonuses of self-publishing is that you're never done. So like in trad publishing, my sister has written both indie and trad. So she's hybrid. And her trad book basically got put out, and then there's a specific term for this, but I don't remember what it is. But essentially, it doesn't sell well enough. They do not print more, and you're done
Okay.
because they own your rights. You can't do anything with that book unless you can get your rights back, which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't. But with a self-publishing career, you can rebrand your books, you can change, you can edit them again, you can change the covers, you can launch a campaign, you can try again. So that is one of the biggest pluses of self-publishing. And so like you're talking about with your marketing, somebody that maybe put out their debut, they didn't do that stuff and now they're in the hole, they could still benefit from something like that and
Yeah,
try
oh,
again.
that's a really good point. That I didn't know that like in trad publishing. Well, I mean, I guess I did know that they own your rights and that you don't really have
Yes.
much control over what's going on. But
Yep.
yeah, self-publishing, you have total control. You could essentially do whatever you want and reinvent.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, awesome. So I mean, I suppose you get asked this question a lot, but who are some of your favorite authors or favorite books that you've read?
Yeah. So Tamara Pierce is pretty standard. I read her as a kid. Juliette Marillier wrote the Seven Waters
Okay.
series. The first one is a telling of the Six Swans, and that's one of my favorite fairy tales, and it's just very beautifully atmospheric. Grace Draven is the one that made me realize that fantasy romance was a thing. I didn't know that it was a thing. I thought I was weird. So that was cool. And then classic fantasy folks like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman wrote the Dragonlance books based on D&D, Tolkien, but
Of course.
primarily women writers. Robin McKinley is a favorite of mine. So yeah,
Great.
a bit
Well,
of it.
and then the last question that we have. So you've built like a really rich world with the Mages of the Wheel universe. What's next? Or is there going to be anything next?
Yeah, there will be. I haven't nailed it down. I have a few ideas. I don't want to spend too much time immersing into an idea because I get that like squirrel, that like shiny object thing. And so I really want to concentrate and finish Mages of the Wheel. I have an idea for whatever I do next will be shorter. Trilogy at
Okay.
most. I highly recommend doing a shorter series to
Yeah.
start with. So probably still fantasy romance, probably still ancient or older setting. But I also have ideas for more like paranormal urban fantasy, a
Ooh.
sci-fi I'd like to do. It's all romance though. I was just telling my husband this morning, while I would like to be considered legitimate in the fantasy community, and it's a struggle as a fantasy romance writer, I don't know that I can write something without romance. It happens even when I don't mean for it to.
So this thing of people saying like, oh, romantasy is not a real genre or whatever, I struggle with that because there's like 500 pages of really cool fantasy going on, and then there's this subplot of romance in there, and there's a few spice scenes, and then all of a sudden it's not legitimate anymore. And I just
Yeah.
don't understand. Like, what did you forget about
Right.
everything else that I
Meanwhile,
built?
George R. R. Martin is fine.
Exactly. Exactly. Like,
Um,
why is Game of Thrones not considered a romantasy?
Yeah, it is. It's a frustration. And I mean, I understand because there's a spectrum of romantasy and all of it right now is kind of shoved together. And I would argue that there's actually a place where some of that needs to maybe get pushed back into what I would call erotica. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but like people come into it and they want different levels of those things. And right now there's almost no separation.
Yeah.
And it's still kind of finding its legs. And unfortunately, with everything being crushed in, it's a little bit too big of a spectrum,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree. Thank you so much
thank
for
you.
all of your answers were wonderful. They were useful for me personally, which I'm sure will be useful for all of the aspiring authors that I have on my list as
I
well.
hope so. Thank you for the
Yeah,
opportunity.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Jen. This was awesome.
Thank you. It was very nice to chat with you. I hope you have a good afternoon.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.